So now we've got to grips with our dies and our die cutting machine. What can we actually do with them? What sort of projects can we make? How do we make those projects? So let's have a little think about some of those ideas. Dies are fantastic because they can be used on all sorts of projects. Paper crafting, fabric, applique, mixed media, you name it, there'll probably be a usage for a die. So we're talking about card making, scrapbooking, mini books, mixed media, home decor, all sorts of beautiful projects can incorporate dies and take your projects to the next level. So I just want to show you a few simple ideas, maybe get your juices flowing, and you'll probably come up with your own, I'm sure, as you get to go through this with me. So I'm going to go back to my own favourite machine, and remember we're going to have our large base plate. I'm going to use my cutting plate underneath, so that means I'm going to be having my die with its cutting edges facing down, so that means that my cardstock needs to go next to the platform. And I'm going to cut a tag. Tags are fabulous, and you can get lots of different tag shaped dies, lots of sizes with different features, but we're just going to do a simple tag. So I've got my die with the cutting edge facing the cardstock, and that's facing my cutting plate. And then I'm going to use my second cutting plate, remember, on top to complete our sandwich. Now, one thing I want to show you is an issue that might rear its ugly head when you're cutting. So I'm going to place my die face on in the machine. So this straight edge here is parallel to where the roller is under here. Okay, and I'm going to run that through the machine. Now you might hear rather a loud jolt when I get to the roller, and it's suddenly I can't turn the handle. So did you hear that? Not great. That's because, let me come back. Okay, that straight edge is hitting the roller, so the roller is taking all of the pressure at this one very narrow point. Now if I turn that over, it has cut, but the machine wasn't particularly happy, and sometimes it won't cut because it actually jumps over that ridge. So what can we do to avoid that? I mean, if you think about hitting a speed bump with your car and you hit it head on with your wheels, especially if you haven't realised there was a speed bump coming up, and you jump over the edge of that speed bump, and it's not a very pleasant experience. However, if you were to approach that speed bump at an angle, so one wheel hits it first and the next wheel follows it, you don't get that horrible jolt. And it's exactly the same with our dies going through the rollers. So all we need to do is twist our project. So now the pressure is going to roll onto this corner, and it's going to disperse down these two sides more evenly, and it won't have that horrible jump. So let's try this. Okay. No jump, didn't hear a loud bang. And we now have a beautifully cut tag, which we can use. It can just be a simple gift tag, or we can actually use that in a project. So what if we're cutting a really small die and I've got this huge cutting plate? Do I need to use this huge cutting plate? Well, no, you don't. It doesn't matter. You can use a huge plate for a small die. You can't use a small plate for a huge die. But if we've got lots of little dies, sometimes we don't want to be winding this big plate all the way through the machine. Well, I have a tip for you. If you have small plates as well, or you might buy small plates to go alongside your big machine, they will go through this machine just as easily, but actually you can also put them through sideways, so you don't have as much winding to do. So if you're cutting smaller dies, it's quite useful to have smaller plates as well. So let's have a look at where we might use a tag. Let me move my machine out of the way so you can see. All right, so here is a little pocket book. Now this could be for containing a gift card. It could go into an art journal or a personal journal. It's entirely up to you. But here you can see that I've incorporated some inks and some stamps and turned those tags into something a lot more interesting. And then inside here, we've got a little notebook that we've made. So you can use your tags in lots of ways, in lots of really interesting projects. And once you get familiar with the shapes and the dies and what you can do to them, your projects are going to take on a whole nother look. So that's just one little idea using some tags. Here's another little pocket book, and this one, again, you could use this if you like art journaling. You could certainly use this in a journal. It's just tied together, and then in here we've got some more little tags done with different shapes of dies. So these are what we're looking at. So a little label shape, a tag and a smaller label. These two came from the same set. Remember we talked about layering dies, how you get all the different sizes in the same shape? Well, that's where these two have come from a rectangle set. So again, just nice little projects, not difficult to do at all, but really quite interesting once you start to add some detail to them. And here's a card in the same vein. So again, I've created a little pocket, and then in the pocket, I've tucked all these little tags, using stamps to enhance them further, and inks. And this doily shape in the background, that's also a die cut. Really pretty, quite intricate, but that's something we can look at in more detail. Another little feature that I wanted to show you well, it probably exists with all the dies actually, but particularly with the layering dies. And here I've got a set of ovals. Okay. When you look at the die, you'll see that it has the cutting ridge that we've talked about. This particular set has the stitch detail that we mentioned earlier on both sides of that cutting ridge. Just ignore that for now. But the flat part of the die, okay, to the outside of the ridge is called a flange. And it just means an extension to something, a flange. So that flange, when you cut the die, actually covers up part of the cardstock, because the area between the inside of this shape and the ridge, that section there is actually covered up by the die. So you can use that to create a feature with these sorts of dies. So let me just quickly cut you one of these ovals and I can show you exactly what I mean. So I'm going to cut this oval for you through my machine. So I've got my cutting plate underneath, my cardstock and my die with the cutting ridge facing down and facing the card. And then I'm going to have my second plate on the top of that to create the sandwich and give the pressure we need. Okay, so we can go through. You don't have to go all the way through, you can come back the other way, but it isn't necessary to actually cut the shape. Passing it through once will allow it to cut. So there's our little oval, and now can I show you this trick, which is really cool. And it's a feature which I learnt about years and years ago from a company called Spellbinders, who were one of the first that I knew about who produced dies to cut stacking shapes. And this was something they used to do. But over the years, we've kind of forgotten about it as dies have become more advanced and we've had other things to think about. But I think it's really cool. So if I just flip this over, you'll see that there's the oval, it's been cut, but I haven't removed it from the die and I haven't removed my die from the paper. I just want it to stay there while I do this little process. I'm actually now going to introduce a little bit of colour into the centre of this die cut. Now, if I'd taken this die out of the die cut, sorry, out of the die, at this point I would be colouring all of the shape. This will make more sense when I take the die off. So I'm just very, very lightly, I don't want this heavy, adding a little bit of that lovely blush to the centre of the die cut. And now when I take this die off my die cut, let's pop that out from the cardstock. So the other thing that you need to remember as well is that you also get an aperture. When you've cut a shape, you're left with the window. Sometimes that's just waste, but sometimes that can be another feature in itself and can be really useful. So bear that in mind as well. So let's have a look now. I've got my very lightly inked centre to the oval. Now when I take my die off, can you see how that has that lovely crisp white edge that was protected by the flange on the die? So the ink hasn't been able to get to that bit of the cardstock, and I've now got this lovely coloured centre to my shape, and it's just another little detail. And because I was using a water-based ink, you can just rinse that under the tap and dry it, and that won't harm your die at all. So let's have a look at some other project ideas. I've got some here featuring those lovely leaves from nature. So that big leaf die that I started off showing you right at the beginning of this video, I've now introduced it to some colour using some inks and a coloured background. It's still a relatively simple card. It's a background, it's the die cut, and it's a panel with nature written on it and some a lacy border here. Nothing too complicated, but still quite attractive, and that die cut is so beautiful, it really makes it, doesn't it? And there's the same idea, but with a slightly added feature of a corner here. Now I'm going to talk about that sort of die in more detail. This is what we refer to as a die that cuts in. It leaves a pattern, but it doesn't cut out a shape. So this is cutting out a shape, and this is leaving a pattern in. So we'll come back to that. A black die cut can be very dramatic. So here I've got an inky background, I've got a pattern cut in, and I've got this black die cut. How striking is that? I love that. Again, all really simple. You can do any of these ideas, but it's how you put your colours together, it's how you choose your papers, it's how you choose your accessories. So there we've got, again, the pattern cut in, the shape cut out, a simple border with some hessian this time, a little bit of twine, and just a little button, a little metal button, all just little features that bring it all together. And then a thank you, again cut with die cut alphabets. So there's just a few ideas of cards. Obviously the choices are endless. So what about other projects? Well, again, sticking with the leaves and flowers, because that's keeping you on track hopefully. What about something that you could use for home decor? So these are two panels that I've framed. The panels are things that I've made on my jelly plate. That's a whole nother subject. But it could be an inky background, it could be a piece of decorative paper, it can be whatever you've got to hand. And then again, those lovely die cuts with colour added. And that could be added with pens, pencils, paints, sprays, ink pads, whatever you've got available. But those would look lovely in a conservatory. I might put these in my bathroom. I really like that idea. Nice as gifts as well. So I'm hoping you're beginning to see how versatile these die cuts can really be and how far you can take them. Now, if you want to get really fancy, you can start doing mixed media projects and home decor projects like this one. I've brought this to show you because it does feature die cuts. So down here we've got a flourish, and that was from one of these deep dies that I showed you earlier from Sizzix. Do you remember these? So this is a design from Tim Holtz, and it has the flourishes there. And I've cut these from cork sheet. You can buy cork in sheets, and it's quite tricky to cut and make it look half decent. But using a die, it cuts beautifully, very crisp, clean edges, and it makes a fantastic feature. This one here, this border, is also cut from a die from cork. And then if we have a look here at the bird cage, that again is cut with one of these deep dies, and that was cut from grey board, which is notoriously difficult to cut because it's like a pulp. So it's quite dusty and it has tiny particles in it, and you don't tend to get very clean edges. But with a steel rule die, it cuts it beautifully. And then up here you can see this flower, and that's a layering die, but the layers create the different petals of the flower. Then you can shape them and create a beautiful flower with them. So I just wanted to show you something that was a bit more adventurous. You might already be down that line, and you might just need some ideas as to how to use die cuts in a project like this. And then finally, another project I'd like to show you is something I'm passionate about, which is making mini books. So something I love to do is making mini books, and this is one that I've made. I brought this because it does feature a lot of die cuts. So these rosettes here were created with a die. Now this was a die that comes on a long thin strip, and it cuts a long thin strip of paper, but it actually scores the pleat lines. So you then concertina it, turn it into a circle and make your rosettes. So that's a die cut. Now if we open this and have a look inside, you'll see just how heavily dies feature within this book. So this oval, which is a space where I was going to put a photograph, so we'd call that a photo mat, that's a die cut. This flourish actually isn't, that was fussy cut from some paper, but this lovely border here, that is a die cut, featuring a trellis and some lovely swirls, really beautiful. And then to complement on this page, I've cut the same die cut but cut it in half, and half of it features here and half of it features here, and those I've left as a little tuck spot to put a photo or some other detail in. The flowers and leaves here are also all cut with dies and then built up into three-dimensional flowers as a really pretty detail. Die cut leaves. I've got a die cut label shape here. The tops of my tags and pocket are also cut with a die. So this little fancy border here has been cut with a die. So are you beginning to see how versatile die cuts really are? And also on this side I've reflected the same pattern on the tags and pockets of this flip out book. And again, these little tabs all done with die cuts. This one done with a die cut. The border actually was done with a punch, remember them, still dead useful. And again the tab, that's a die, and the pocket here, the little corner there, was actually done with a punch, but you could do that with a die. You can get corner dies as well. And then here we've got some little tags, all cut with a die. If I remember rightly, I think those were by Marianne Designs, and that has a little flap that opens there as well. And again, a punched border, but you can get border dies, so you could do something like that with a border die quite easily. And then this little closure on this panel is actually done from a nesting die, so it's a label shape, and I've just used half of it. So this is one half of that label shape, and I've used that to create the closure for my flip up pocket there. So as I say, dies, super versatile. You can take them to whatever level. You can keep it simple if that's your style, or you can go and do a full-on project like this one. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give us a thumbs up, press the like button and subscribe so that you can catch the next one. See you then.